Fun fact, listening to the Reddit Ranger makes you 50% less likely to be involved in an owlbear attack. Okay, today we're going to continue with Naiavita's campaign. This is Session 3, Owlbears and Anguish. As the sun crested over the treetops, I was awoken by a shrill cry. Demos was in his room, screaming. I ran down the hall and tried to enter, but the door was locked. I pounded on the door, asking him what was wrong, and the screaming stopped. I pressed my ear to the door, and I could just barely make out a voice. It was certainly not Demos, but who else could it possibly be? Then the door opened, spilling me onto the floor with a thud. I looked up to see Demos standing there, staring at me like I was the strange one.
What in the heck was that all about?
I asked as I scrambled to my feet, but he just stood there looking as puzzled as I was. What are you talking about? I could feel the wind from my furrowing brow and tried as best as I can to describe the unholy sound he had made mere moments ago. But to no avail, as he claimed to have forgotten waking up half of Fandalen. Then he asked me a question that, among other things, cost me sleep. Where are we? He glanced around the room and down the hall. I stared at him, and something in his eyes told me he genuinely did not know where we were.
We're in Fandalen. We just arrived last night, and now it's morning. We brought Sildar with us. Does any of this ring a bell?
He shook his head.
Did you hit your head or something? You were asleep in the cart when we got back. You're lucky there were no goblins left.
He stared at me, his face twisting in what can best be described as a mixture of bewilderment and terror. I decided to try something a bit more personal.
You broke your dagger. Do you remember that?
His eyes were wide as can be, and he drew the dagger from its sheath. He stared at the chipped blade for what could have only been a few seconds, but it felt like hours. It was as if he was convincing himself that the events of the last day actually happened. He stowed the dagger and pushed past me, heading down the stairs and out the door. When I tried to ask him where he was going, he just muttered something about getting his dagger fixed. What was all that noise up there? Asked Othin from the table. He was enjoying breakfast alongside Valanthia and Thoril. I shook my head and asked the innkeeper if he had any tea. He did, and poured me a mug and offered a plate of chicken for the table. I thanked him and took a seat next to Thoril, who slid a plate of bread in front of me. We were nearly finished eating when Demos walked back in and joined us. He plopped down in his seat and inhaled a loaf of bread and half the chicken. When he managed to actually speak, his voice was calm and quiet. Sorry about this morning. I'm sure you all heard me. I had a nightmare, that's all. Valanthia stood and headed for the door. We all joined her and stepped out into the streets. The morning air was warming quickly in the sunlight, and the various shops were beginning to open to the first customers.
Well, where to first? Should we check on Sildar? He does still owe us both a reward and a lead.
Demos reached into his pocket and tossed her a pouch of gold. Already got it.
What? When did you...
I ran into him on the way back from the smithy. He said he is still trying to follow up on a few leads, but he had the gold with him.
Were you going to tell us about it?
She crossed her arms, half tempted to count the money. I needed to finish my chicken, he grinned and slapped her on the shoulder. After discussing it amongst ourselves, we decided the best course of action was to head to Barthan's provisions and offload anything we weren't going to need anymore. Those goblins had little of value, but not all of it was junk. We sold off what we could, I refilled my quiver, and we left. On our way out the door, however, we were met by a group of ruffians. 4 humans who looked nearly as bad as they smelled, all sporting dark red cloaks. The largest one stepped forward, spitting a glob at our feet and glowering. See here, we don't want strangers like you poking about. Shove off or there's gonna be trouble. I placed a hand on my scimitar and waited while Othin spoke. Listen, we don't want any trouble, but I don't think you want this fight anyways. The thugs exchanged glances, then started laughing. In a flash, they drew their swords and lunged. I jumped back as one of them tried to corner me. He left a deep gash in my leg, but failed to land another blow. Valanthia slashed one of them across the chest and pursued him as he stumbled back. Thoril took a swing at the leader's midsection, but he managed to duck and plunge his blade into Thoril's gut. He staggered back as the ruffian moved closer. Demos had gained the attention of my attacker, giving me the chance to pull back and draw my bow. I knocked an arrow and sank it into the leader's arm, giving Thoril time to get his bearings. Valanthia set fire to her target as Othin unleashed a scatter of magic missiles, which peppered the thugs and managed to finish off the burning one. Demos tried to deflect an incoming blow but was knocked off balance and pushed back. The thug slammed him up against the side of the building and struck him hard in the chest. Demos coughed blood and slumped to the ground. Thoril managed to shove his assailant away and take a swing, but he was delirious with pain and caught nothing but air. I fired once again and landed a direct hit, dropping one of them. As Valanthia skewered her foe, Othin unleashed another volley of magic missiles and killed another. The last survivor made a run for it, but only made it a few meters before being incinerated with another cast of produced flame. I ran to Thoril and examined his wound, a deep gash in his midsection, made significantly worse by the scuffle. I helped him staunch the flow of blood, while Valanthia tended to Demos. While pretty beat up, a soothing spell did wonders, and he was back on his feet within a few minutes. Hours passed, going back and forth across the tiny village. We spoke to just about everyone in town. Of note, we spoke to Kellen Alderleaf, a halfling farmer living on the southern edge of town. She suggested seeking Rydoth, a druid currently residing in the ruins of Thundertree to the north, east of Neverwinter. He may know where we might find Cragmaw Castle, but she had not seen any goblins recently. Her young son suddenly ran to us and shared with us quite the tale. He said several nights ago he had seen a group of red brands, the bright red guys who nearly murdered us, talking with some big hairy bandits in a wooded glade near the farm. He followed them for a time and discovered a tunnel into the side of the cliffs where an old abandoned manor rests on the outskirts of the village. This manor, Tressendar Manor, was said to be the base of operations for the Red Brands. Their leader, a man only known as Glasstaff, had slowly but surely driven out the militia and named himself the sole power in Faldalin. A brutal killer, he has quashed any attempts to subvert his authority. The young lady at the Shrine of Luck asked us to look into the whereabouts of a particular spellbook, last seen in the possession of a banshee. This banshee, called Agatha, might answer our questions in exchange for a jeweled comb. It seems in life she was quite proud of her looks. Hopefully she doesn't take her current appearance too hard. We also heard about some troubles at the Old Owl Well, a mining camp. The miners had fled the well when the undead began to appear in startling numbers as of late. Oh joy! After bickering about where to go, Demos took a page from my journal and drew a pair of crossed lines. He then wrote the names of several locations in each segment. Yes, this full-grown adult was actually making a paper spinner. Having given up completely at this point, I agreed to link my fate to this children's toy. Thundertree was nearly 50 miles north of here, so we decided to rent the ox cart we had rode into town. The air was cool and quiet, the sun having set about an hour prior. Barthan was not in his shop, but the barkeep said he had a small cottage behind the store. Demos tapped at the door so quietly I'm not even sure he could hear it. I rolled my eyes, leaned around him, and firmly rapped at the door. Demos did not look appreciative. As a rogue, he is not accustomed to attracting attention. After a few minutes, the door cracked open and Barthan appeared out into the darkness. Oh, it's you folks. Is there something you need? He asked sleepily.
Hey, Barthan, we were wondering if we could possibly purchase the use of your ox cart to take us out of town tonight. We had a bit of trouble and think it best if we left as soon as possible.
His brow lowered, showing a mixture of confusion and frustration. Oh, well, do you need it right this instant? Could it not wait till morning? Please, sir, we really would like to leave before first light. Try as he might, he could not sway the trader, who gruffly told us to wait until morning before shutting the door in our faces. With no other options, we returned to the inn and took turns keeping watch downstairs, lest we fall victim to another attack. As the sun peeked out from behind the trees, I made my way downstairs where the others were seated. Annoyed that we were still in town at this hour, I ordered a stout ale and gingerly sipped it while Demos headed for the door. I tossed him a small pouch with a few gold pieces and told him to rent that cart, hoping Barthen would be in a more agreeable mood this morning. I had not finished half my drink when Demos slinked back into the inn, looking sheepish to say the least.
Well,
I asked.
Do you need any help loading up the supplies?
I brought the mug to my lips for another drink. Yeah, well, he was willing to rent us the cart. For 100 gold pieces. I nearly choked as I spat ale across the table, completely taken aback by the sheer gall of this merchant. Had he no gratitude? I took the purse back from Demos as it would do us no good. We fussed over what to do, and Demos proclaimed he was going back and would not leave without a better deal. I jokingly suggested having sad music backing him up to his desperate pleas, and he wholeheartedly agreed. He thought it was a brilliant idea when in reality it had been little more than a snide comment. I shrugged, picked up my viol, and followed him out. Barthen seemed to be in better spirits this morning, and Demos once again began his clearly rehearsed speech. As he did so, I drew the bow across the strings in a somber melody. One of my strings immediately snapped and hit me in the face. As Demos cleared his throat loudly to hide the adult language coming from the bushes, Barthen seemed amicable to our predicament. He agreed to only charge us 75 gold and assured us we would get 50 back if we returned the cart in decent condition. Pulling my hair over my new nefarious facial scar, I returned to the tavern with Demos and we gathered up the down payment. After loading the wagon, we set out north from town along the Tribor Trail, heading west to the high road. We made camp at the crossroads and Valanthia took first watch. About an hour or so into the night, she heard a skittering in the underbrush. She peered through the foliage, ready to strike, only to be met with the hissing of an opossum. She shook her head, shooed the vermin away, and Thoril took the next watch. The stars had begun to fade as dawn drew nearer when Thoril was startled to attention by a hideous sound. A low bellow called out from the nearby thicket, and out of the bushes charged an enormous beast. It plowed straight into Thoril and knocked him to the ground. He was barely able to call out as he turned to face his attacker. Owlbear! I leapt from my seat and drew my bow in time to see Valanthia and Demos rush the beast. Thoril kicked at it in an attempt to escape its grasp, but it dug its claws into his chest as he let out a scream. Demos planted his short sword into its side. It reared back, roaring at us, while Valanthia flung a ball of white flames at it. Its fur ignited and it flailed about, slashing and biting. My arrow found purchase in its neck, its fur becoming matted with blood. As it slashed at Thoril again, he let out a loud roar and grabbed it by the nape. Raging against his attacker, he managed to push it aside and spring to his feet. I whispered a prayer to Sylvanas and fired another arrow. As it struck the owlbear, vines sprang up around it and began to entangle its legs. But it was too strong and ripped through the vines as it charged again. Othin hit it with a firebolt and it let out a shrill cry. As Thoril tried to put distance between himself and the beast, however, it slashed at him and tore his back open. He fell limply to the ground, blood pooling on the cold grass. As another arrow landed in its shoulder, it began to stagger a bit, clearly nearing the end. Sensing this weakness, Valanthia slashed at it with her scimitar, and Demos drove his dagger into its back. In a last-ditch effort to survive, it spun wildly and made a run towards the woods. Othin cast magic missile, and the bolts of energy hurtled towards the beast. They buffeted against the creature, and it finally slumped to the ground. Valanthia ran to Thorol's side to check his condition. Her silence spoke volumes. Othin hung his head while Deimos dropped to the ground beside him, gripping the grass and cursing. I sank to my knees, sighed, and said a prayer. That was r/DnDStories. You've been listening to the Reddit Ranger. Now, to further protect yourself and your loved ones from owlbear attacks, make sure to like and subscribe.